I recently had a great conversation with Coach Karch and Jimmy Stitz of the USA Women's National Program. In this portion of that conversation, we begin with Coach Karai talking about the different phases of training they're utilizing to bring their athletes back safely for return to play. And then we go into some detail about acute to chronic workload ratios and some features with the VERT platform that can be utilized by any programs to ensure that you bring your athletes back safely and in a manner that gets them ready for gameplay and decreases the risk for injury. Because in the end, that's the goal. I hope you enjoy.
Basically, it's about 8 weeks. Once you can actually once an athlete can get back to a quality weight room, like maybe not every piece of equipment, but a quality workout facility, and get back to volleyball activities, even if they're limited. I think they've brought up created a really sound conservative concept. We wouldn't feel comfortable with any of our players being thrown into a match with us. And of course, that's impossible because we have no competition this year. All of that's been canceled or postponed. Or they get called back to their professional teams sooner. But either way, we and many of the club coaches agree with this, that all of this time off means that they need a longer ramp up than they've ever had in their quote preseason before they get to their first competition. To us, that's about 8 weeks. The first 4 weeks and the second 4 weeks maybe look different, and Jimmy can take you through that. But so what's going to happen with our players is some will need to report to their club teams. Basically, the International Federation said, well, all of our competition's been postponed this year, so nothing going on internationally. No country versus country competitions this summer. So clubs, you can call your players back anytime from June 1st on. Well, June 1st was 10 days ago. And some of our athletes are going to have to leave in less than a week to go back. So, but a lot of those teams asking for them to come back, what a very common date for them to say, we need you to report, would be July 1st. And that makes perfect sense to us because we know that they want to play matches, start their league very early in September. And so we're right on the same line with them because July 1st gives them July and August. And now we feel like that's an appropriate amount of time to help them slowly but surely get ready for the intensity of league competition, live competition. And so July 1st actually makes sense to us. We're on the same page with them a lot. But what some teams are saying is, oh, you've already been doing this, or you've already been doing that at home in your basement, and now you're doing this volleyball too. Okay, well, we don't want to have you show up on July 1st because you're already going to be at around 50%, but the rest of our team will have been doing nothing and they're at 0%. It makes no sense to ask the American player on that foreign club team to report at that time when other players might have not been doing anything in their basement, not touching a ball, no jumping and landing forces. And so most of our athletes will probably be, not all, but many will be leaving probably between a week from now or a little less, and maybe late July. And so again, I'll pass it over to Jimmy in terms of what do those phases and what do those 8 weeks look like of return to absolute normal intensity volleyball?
Yeah, and I think Karch laid it out perfectly well. The idea was, when it comes to athlete health, I think I'm always going to err on the conservative side, and it's going to take some convincing from people to try to move me off of that position when it comes to just making sure our people are able to compete for their clubs but also for us, and hopefully in a little over a year from now. And so this idea of 8 weeks was a 4-week block of time where we were going to focus a lot on reconditioning the body, getting it physically ready for volleyball activity, and then another 4 weeks of more volleyball activity, ramped up volleyball activity, and a continuation of the conditioning of the body. And so what we understand is more or less, and you can kind of go back and forth in the research between this, but most human bodies tend to adapt on about a 4-week cycle. And so phase is another term we'll use for that. So we've kind of developed 2 phases of training that are built on the last 2 months that our players have gone through, that will allow them, in our minds, to conservatively get back on the court and be as ready as can be asked of them at this point. I think there's no playbook for this.
Yep.
Nobody's ever done anything quite like this. And so this is just the aggregation of a lot of information with Kara, who Karch has mentioned. We work very closely together. She's a rock star, and myself. And then we have other collaborators in our environment with our men's program as well that helped us kind of come to this conclusion. And I think we're paralleling each other pretty well, and time will tell how close we came to the proper mixture of conditioning and volleyball activity.
Well, and I'll tell you, I was having, almost this exact same conversation with Dr. Kerry McDonald, who I know we've talked about with Canadian national program, and actually forgot to finish my thought before, but when I submitted a recommendation to AVCA to submit to NCAA, it was a minimum of, if we could get them a minimum of 5 weeks on the court. And Carrie said, yeah, that'd be the minimum, but we'd really like 8. I'm like, I agree. And we had this almost exact same conversation. But again, with colleges, we have to kind of take what we can get. And there's a lot of discussions now where they might be extending it to 6 weeks potentially. Because as you probably know, they usually get 2.5 to 3 weeks on the court, and then it's time to roll. So, but it's advantageous, obviously, and I've said this in a few webinars. I think in volleyball, we're incredibly lucky in a way, and even us, Vert, as a business, that volleyball, and Karch is a big reason for this, you guys absorbed us quickly, that this is a sport where we happen to know the main load variables. Like, we know that jump on our front row and our higher risk injury athletes, we can actually count the jump and the landing. I think that as a sport almost puts us ahead from a monitoring standpoint. But Jimmy, now, so it looks like with some of the athletes, and I'm screen share here so we can talk about this, you might finally be able to do a little bit. This is something that Jimmy and I have been talking about for quite some time, right?
Years. Yep.
Sure. The acute to chronic workload ratios. And Jimmy, I'll let you talk about the concept in general, and then I'll kind of tag team a little bit and go over what I'm showing on the screen.
Yeah, certainly. And like you said, we've talked about this for a number of years, and I consider it just to be smart training and smart coaching. But there's been a boon in the research of this, as well as monitoring has become such a big part of all sports, not just professional, but amateur sports as well. And now that we can measure these things, we have an understanding or a better insight into how progressions and regressions should happen for players if we can measure the aspect of their sport that causes the most stress to their system. And so, like you mentioned, jumping being kind of the go-to one in volleyball. What acute to chronic ratios allows you to do is to avoid big spikes one way or another, long periods of high intensity work for too long and low intensity periods for too long. Each has their own potential pitfalls. And so, which is one of the reasons why we were so mindful during this downtime to be providing the athletes some avenue to avoid the dip, if you will. Mm-hmm. And now as we're coming back, we're going to deal with the other side of that. And so you mentioned, I believe I heard you mention 10 to 15% increases from week to week. And that's absolutely where we sit every week. We started our first wave of players at 60 jumps as our kind of baseline, knowing that they had been doing some training ahead of time, and have increased by 15% each week. And that has been our standard. And I don't see any reason for us, at least as we're making our way through it, to change that too much. Obviously, each athlete responds a little differently. Not everyone can handle 15%. Some maybe need to stay the same. Some potentially even less. But that's an avenue that I think you explore on an individual basis as much as you possibly can, and try not to hold it to a team standard as often as possible. Much like a college, I'm sure, is going to run into shortly. They're going to have some players who were were dominating their time away in quarantine and doing all sorts of things to help prepare themselves for what they know is coming. And then they're going to have other players who took advantage of the time away, and they're going to have to find a balance between each group and figure out exactly what works for their team. But the idea of an individual approach to acute to chronic workload, I think, is absolutely paramount when it comes to making sure your athletes can stay playing for you, and again, keeping athlete health as the number one priority.
And another thing I would jump in with from obviously, we volleyball coaches are taking all of our guidance from Jimmy and Kara and their hard work and diligence in developing these plans. But as Jimmy mentioned, it might be around 60 jumps in week 1 for those 3 sessions. But we're also paying close attention to the other thing that any player who plays in the front row has to worry about, and that is stress on the shoulder. Because in fact, if anything, we're doing fewer swings than jumps, and being particular, that might be. So when I was asking Jimmy, okay, so what do we do week 1? What does it look like? And he said, well, if we're going to go around 60, it might be maybe around 25 serves, around 20 block jumps, and around 15 attacks, because their shoulders have been without stress for a really long time, and we've got to account for that factor too. So it's not just a jump thing, but it's the shock of the most explosive movements, and those are 2 key ones: the jump and the landing that goes with each jump, and then of course the shock to shoulders, especially when they're taking normal volleyball swings.
Well, and this is something that we launched, I think, 3 days before everything shut down, and what we were actually hoping to be putting out here shortly was our arm swing, which I hadn't even mentioned to you guys yet. But we've been collecting data on that. We just have to collect more data to where you can take the sensor and put it on the arm, because yeah, that's the one aspect that, from a load perspective, essentially, that we're missing at this point. But when we're talking about acute to chronic, I think it's great, especially when I think back, Coach, when you all first started using this, and with certain players, it was, cap them here, because they, like with Krista, for example, like she felt good up to this number. We don't want to go past this number. And this has been a really fun evolution. And I think I'd be remiss if I didn't go into a little more of an overview for people watching who aren't even familiar with what in the heck, how you do this, like how this works. And so to briefly go over it, you see this, like Jimmy's talking about the spikes. This would be the undertraining, overtraining. You kind of want to have variability in this area. And it's a ratio, 0.8 to 1.3. What that means, let's say for the last month, you were jumping 100 times every day. That's your chronic load. Again, the conditioning, what Jimmy's getting everyone ready, the body, the capacity, how you're building that. Then your acute load is what you're doing now or this week. So if we jumped 100 times last month and we jump 100 times this week, right, we're at a 1. That's fine, but not the best for adaptation, no variability, right? If you were to jump up to 130 times this week, you got to be a 1.3. You jump down to 80. And again, these are really easy number examples. You drop down to 0.8. So again, this is meant to be just a visual guide to make sure that, programs can easily and objectively build that capacity. And then this piece, and Jimmy, I don't even recall if I got to show you this one. But as you might imagine, the question we get asked probably the most is, all right, so what's a high, medium, low day look like?
Whoa, somebody did 360.
That's their center.
Okay.
This is real data.
I'm guessing they had very few people in the gym. Maybe they had one middle blocker, and they're trying to play 6-on-6 volleyball.
So this was the this was taken October to November, I believe.
Woo.
SEC program. This player, actually player 11, is a 6 rotation outside who jumped more in Division I volleyball than any other athlete in Division I volleyball. We actually correlated that with their number of swings they took in volumetrics. The cool thing is, on their starting players, they didn't miss as much as a practice from injury in 5 seasons.
Great.
Yeah, it's one of those incredible stories. But But what we did is we wanted to figure out a way to answer that question as objectively as humanly possible. What's a low, medium, and high day? And as we've been discussing, you can't determine that if you don't know what they've done, right? Like
Right.
for the setter, she's got crazy high volume. Theoretically, she's built up that capacity. She does not jump very high. And then you have this outside who, a high day for her might be 168, but here's another 3 rotation outside, 106. Why? Because she averages in a match about 19 jumps a set. She averages 33 jumps a set. So what we want to do is make sure we did it as individualistically as possible. And again, Jimmy and I have been talking about this for years. So it's like giddy to launch it. And then the second we launch it, but first world problems on that side. But we're excited now that, as programs start ramping back up, especially if they are given, if they do get those 5 to 6 weeks, just like we discussed, that'll give them the ability to say, hey, we're starting at, it's going to be fairly arbitrary, 50 jumps. We're growing 10 to 15% week over week. And by week 6, 7, we'll be comfortably at the low 100s. And we already know that the average jump count per middle blocker Division I is about 103 jumps. And for an outside is 84 jumps, I believe. Right? We have those numbers now after about 7 years of data collection. Mm-hmm. So they have a very clear target. They just need to have the time to be able to slowly grow and get there, to do it as, healthily as humanly possible.
It's interesting you bring that up, because I think Karch will remember plenty of practice planning meetings we've had. And the conversation we have is our middles are our limiting factor when it comes to how long or how intensive a practice can we have. In my mind, there's not enough middles on the planet to keep practice going. We got to, however many middles we got to keep them going as best we can, as safe as we can, because practice more or less has to change dramatically as those players, again, going individually, as they begin to approach their jump count limits for the day, things have to start to change. And so on days we're really good with keep an eye on those things and have planned things appropriately and things have gone well, practice goes off without a hitch. But our coaching staff does a wonderful job of realizing, as things are adapting in real time, that potentially it's time to make a change to the practice plan or keep the long game going. And so our coaching staff does that as well, if not better than anybody that I can think of. But middles are absolutely the key to being able to sustain practice above and beyond the normal circumstances.
And I think a lot of this really came from an even more fundamental question. David, you were showing us earlier a light, a medium, a heavy day, and the more fundamental question that we asked ourselves originally is, because we want to help our athletes be the best they can be, to reach their potential. So we have to design training in such a way that it will be productive and a great investment of their time. So the question is, what is the load? Until we asked this question not that many years ago, we didn't have the answer to how many times is the average middle blocker going to jump in a typical international match. A 4-set match would be typical. How many times does a setter? How many times does an opposite? How many times does an outside hitter? Like, that might be good information to know if we need to prepare them for the average international match, and to also understand that, there are times when we might need to train more than that, but there might be times when we need to train less than that. And we can't always be training every day the equivalent of a 5-set match or a 7-set match. So, when those numbers when we first figured that out, it was internationally. Now, this doesn't necessarily apply to college because the rules are a little different and the jumps are distributed amongst more players. We have very few substitutions, so an international middle serves when it's her turn a lot, very little substitution of her coming out. And the average middle jumps about 35 times in a normal 25-point set. The average outside, 25 or a little more. Same for the opposite. And then you end up having a much higher jump count for setters who don't necessarily get as high off the ground because they're jumping so much to run the offense. But just having that fundamental, that basic information now starts helping us figure out, okay, so what is appropriate in terms of level of training? Some matches are going to go more than 4 sets. So on certain days, we have to be capable of going more than 140 jumps as a middle, because that 5-set match might take her to 160 or a little more. And so we have to push it sometimes, but we also can't have our middles jumping 200 times 5 days a week. Then now we're not at all helping her reach her potential. So it all started from that fundamental question.
Well, and I brought this up because we've looked at some of the numbers with some international play, and for those players, those teams, especially when you look at the players who are on the court as much as humanly possible, not that big of a difference. Like you said, 5-set match, 160. When we, here, this is your average, right? This is just your average middles and outsides.
And I was just extrapolating, like if I say that a middle jumps 35 on average, 35 times in the course of a 25-point set. So 4 of those takes you to 140. Then the 5th one is going to be something less, probably, almost certainly less than 35. Call it 20. All right, now you're at 160, and you're going to be pushed. And internationally, you might have to play the next day. Yeah, so we can't always back off and say, today you do 160 and tomorrow you do nothing. We might have tomorrow be a better opponent than we played today in a tournament. But we would never do that back to back to back to back to back on a 5-day work week that we work on. So that's where Jimmy and Kara are huge in helping us and being smart. There are times to push, but then there are also times where we have to be smart, and we can't just go all out 110 miles an hour every single practice. Some people might think that's what USA does, but they'd be way wrong, because our athletes in normal non-pandemic conditions are playing over 11 months a year. And they don't have this unique off-season training that Jimmy was talking about earlier. So we have to take care of them, and the burden falls on us to make sure they stay healthy. But healthy doesn't just necessarily mean we're going to baby them and they only do 90 or 100 jumps for a middle. We would also not be doing right by her in that case either.
Hey, you're talking about the peaks and the valleys, right? And obviously I can't give program names, but a lot of people do, and I think it's changing now, frankly. You attribute, heavy, hard training to top programs, but it's fascinating sitting in our chairs, because, we, in the last 7 years now, right? Especially the last 4 or 5, when you're looking again at colleges, the Final 16, Elite 8, Final 4, national championships, most of them have our platform. So it's fascinating to go in there and say, all right, you've got pretty even talent, but I'm looking at the data and I'm like, man, this team that, for example, may have just won, I happen to know jumps less than half on average as the other team in practices. And so it speaks to efficiency, pure and simple.
And to preparing, those higher ranked teams, the Big Ten, the Pac-12, the SEC, the Big 12, the ACC, and teams like BYU and others from WCC, they're preparing to try to win a tournament. And so they have to be prepared to not only be great with a day between, but the first 2 weekends, they face back-to-back matches. And so they have to have had some challenge in training enough to be great and strong enough and healthy enough to play for their team in 2 straight back-to-back 5-set matches that push them to the very limits. That will happen.
And that's the thing, right? And I know Jimmy can speak to this a lot, is physiologically speaking, you can start too high and it can have a lasting effect over the course of the season, as opposed to the more frustrating piece of starting maybe even lower than you wanted to, and slowly building to make sure when it comes time for serious play, the work capacity is there and they're healthy?
Yeah, certainly. I think that seasons are defined by the endings, and so playing the long game is absolutely the recommendation and the way we go about our business in our gym for sure.
Well, awesome. I think we've covered topics that I hope people will find to be helpful. As I mentioned, a lot of these calls, again, you can go on to myvert.com. You can schedule calls with anyone from our staff. Again, client or non-client. Right now, we're just trying to make sure people are educated as best we can to keep the players in the court. And so, especially those young players, keep them healthy and strong. That by the time they get to the Karches and Jimmies of the worlds, they're ready to rock and roll. All right, thanks a lot,
Awesome.
gentlemen.
Thanks for your time, David. Good to meet with you, and good luck to everybody out there. It's a challenging time in lots of ways, and a big one as you're looking at college seasons coming up is how they're going to adapt and adjust. And I wish everybody great health and in this challenge of returning to play after these unique conditions we've been through, and hope to have a great fall season of college volleyball, high school volleyball, club beyond that. Even though a lot of us don't quite know what it's going to look like, we'll be ready for anything.
Yes, sir. All right. Have a great day, guys.
Thank you.